All this love is meant to stay, but it seems so lately have faded away. And I don't know if I could go fast enough to keep the game. If I try, take me out.
Put them
For the reception afterwards. Reward them for those who stay through it all.
They don't roll off because they're not stools. I think let's.
Wow. 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 Worth saying again. I'm Davis. Thank you. This is a powerful way to begin a festival that will only continue to move and impact you throughout the next many days. I'm Davis Shoup, Chief Program Officer here at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. It gives me great honor tonight to welcome to our stage a number of wonderful people who made tonight's film possible. Producer Tonya Lewis-Lee. Producer Nikki Silver. Director Anthony Mandler. Actor Jeffery Wright, come on down. Actor Tim Blake Nelson. Actress Jennifer Ehle. And to moderate, please welcome Taryn Merkyl, Senior Counsel for the Brenner Center's Justice Program and its law enforcement leaders to reduce crime and incarceration initiative. And as though you needed any motivation to stick around and hear what these incredible folks have to say, following this conversation, we welcome you to join us in the lobby on your way out the door for a cocktail or a snack to celebrate the beginning of this powerful festival. Thank you.
So thank you all so much for staying. As somebody who's worked in the criminal justice space for close to 20 years, it really is amazing to see a film of this type that shines a spotlight on so many of the issues that we are currently working on in our effort to make a smarter and fairer criminal justice system. So I'm going to start our questions by actually relating back to the movie. In the film club, the character played by our panelist here, Mr. Nowicki, stated that artists have a story that they have to tell. And I want to know, to the producers and the director, why was this the story that you had to tell?
Well, I have to say, Nikki and Nikki actually found the book Monster by Walter Dean Myers and came to me and said, Tonya, do you want to work with me on this? And as someone who is a lawyer who had contemplated being a civil rights lawyer, actually was on the board of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, as I got into storytelling, to me, storytelling is a way to also shed light on the issues of our time. And when you look at the high rates of mass incarceration in this country, in particular with African-American young men, this was a great way to tell that story based on an incredible book.
So the book, for those of you who haven't read it, actually is written sort of like a screenplay. So how did that adaptation work?
Well, it's interesting because everybody always thought I can talk really loud. So this one? No, that one's not working either.
Hello.
Of course, yours works. It's funny, everybody's initial thought, because the book is written as a screenplay, and for those of you who don't know Walter Dean Myers' work, I encourage all of you. Walter passed about 4 years ago. He is prolific, he is brilliant, And it actually was harder because it was written as a screenplay, because so much of it is so internal, and you just don't take that screenplay and make a screenplay. And it really took a vision and somebody to sort of see from a film perspective and photography perspective how that could be translated. And we had some wonderful writers, and then it really was taken hold by this man to my right, Anthony Mandler, who was able to sort of capture the essence of what Walter was trying to do in Steve's mind. So I'll give it to you, Anthony.
Thank you. You know, I think what really attracted me to the film was the different layers, the internal, the external, dealing with something that really was a mirror to who we were as a society today, sort of a sad narrative, but also the exciting part of a kid who had curiosity and the creative curiosity. And sometimes pursuing that curiosity leads you to a place where you're challenged and forced to deal with things that maybe weren't your intention. And how that meets with the sort of sad criminal justice system we have and how young black males are looked at was really fascinating to me. For me, it was important to sort of attach on to the other side of that story, which was the creative curiosity as being a photographer and a director. But it was through that I was able to sort of channel this larger story that we're talking about. And just as though Nikki said, it was on me sort of interpreting that. At the same time, it was on Kelvin Harrison Jr. to take that role and take that innocence and that complexity and that subtlety to a level that, you know, I think is beyond what we imagined, and really sort of bring Steve alive, you know, off the page, you know.
No doubt, the sort of struggle within him and the internalities and externalities you describe lend so much to understanding his character development and the film. But the visuals, I think, are also so impactful, particularly for those of us who I hope is most of you who haven't spent a lot of time in prisons. But no matter whether you're there for a visit and you know you're going to be able to leave, when you first walk through those prison doors and you hear the click and then the second door click, it's a sound you can never forget. And you did a tremendous job, I think, of bringing prison scenes to life. And I was curious about your process and was wondering if you could share a little bit about how you did research and developed such realistic depictions of what it must feel like and look like to be in jail.
Yeah, I think the key word there is feel, because we have untold examples of what it looks like in the interpretation in film and cinema and documentaries and late night cable. You know, I didn't want that side because we were telling a first person perspective narrative. I wanted to get into the sense of like, what would this really good kid feel like when those doors closed? And in honesty, it was about capturing our actor's first moments. A lot of the stuff you see there is the rehearsal when no one's around. It was actually the first moment when he got in the cell. And I grabbed a camera and followed him, just me and he. And a lot of that stuff in the opening, and a lot of stuff in the middle where he's writing, that's all in the first hour or hour and a half of rehearsals. Because I knew that you could never get that natural reaction again, right? The other thing was to sort of stay away from the cliches, the sort of stabbings and rapes and so all of that stuff that's sort of been populated too much, and stay in the sort of ephemeral sounds and the subtleties of the what's beyond and how that reflects in his fear, because this is a good kid from a great family. This is not a kid that's been anywhere near this, you know, and sort of breaking that stereotype that there's an honesty in like a kid who doesn't know what to do, you know.
And we did shoot it in a real prison that was actually a working prison, just in a section that was not being used at the time. And believe me, Anthony Mandler's prison is a hellish place that you never want to visit.
Well, I want to add one. I'm sorry.
By the way, it was on Kol Nidre, for everybody here who understands that. That's the night that we shot Jeffrey's scene.
Yeah. But one more important thing is that we had a gentleman named Richard Rosario, who had served, I believe, 20 years for a crime he didn't commit. And he went in at 17. And he had just recently come out, and we were introduced to him, and he came in and really talked through a lot of the more subtle things, like the phone being snatched out of his hand. And he talked through that process of, if you're not with a gang or a set, you got to get up first to get the phones, and you have a very short window, and when that window's over, you lose the phone and you can't talk to your family, and they sort of hold the phone privilege over your head. If you're with us, you can use the phone. And how does a kid that has no street knowledge and has no one there to guide him stay alive and sort of stay away from, like I said, from the cliche? So he really helped bring that nuance and that authenticity. And in all fairness, I was telling you earlier that the gentleman that was sort of our guide in the prison, if I ever had doubt, I looked at him, I said, how would this go down? And he was happy to tell me, this is how it happened. And we had incredible extras too. I mean, we had a ton of guys that showed up that had done a lot of time, that were sort of like, this is how it actually happens. And I think as a director, you know, you got to listen in those moments. You know, you have to listen and hear and try to take that in, and that sort of try to keep that authenticity through the whole movie and that nuance, you know.
Well, I love the word you just used there in terms of listening. I think that we all need to listen to people who have been through the system, listen to the survivors, listen to people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system as we seek to make change. And now I want to turn over to the actors a little bit. You know, there's a part in the film when you get to the court scene where you talk about how there's black and white in the law, and there's no shades of gray in the criminal justice system. But I think that this film sheds an incredible light on how many shades of gray there are. And when I was in practice, I used to think of, you know, criminal justice involvement as a spectrum of a million shades of gray, how people get involved, why people get involved, whether they have full knowledge of the circumstances that they're involved in, whether they're merely present, or did they have some knowledge, are they willfully blind, are they being deliberately ignorant? I mean, there's this really complex world that people find themselves in. And so, you know, we have the teacher from a privileged school. We have the father seeking to raise a young black man in a tough neighborhood to some degree, but who also has privilege. And then we have an overworked public defender. And so many shades of gray illustrated by this film. What are your key takeaways? What do you think we should be thinking about from this film as New Yorkers?
Thanks. As New Yorkers, I think it's a very good question in that the film is I think for me personally, but I think in a larger sense, very much about New York and about the ways in which classes kind of interweave and what that means for a young boy like this as he searches outside of the home for representations of manhood. I think it's a big, enormous challenge for young black kids, young black boys particularly, in New York and in our society at large, because too often the rites of passage for young black boys of a certain class is criminality, is incarceration, just owing to the circumstances in which they find themselves. For me, you know, this film was very much about kind of, I guess, meditating on my own fatherhood. With my son was 16, I think, when we were making this, or 15 when we were making this. But I think this, that's an enormous challenge for them. Is trying to find examples going forward of manhood that lead to constructive ends outside the house, even though there's a nice family circle within. There's an epidemic in America among black men. I mean, just disproportionately, negative outcomes that every family, every black person in this building right now can testify to. And it's a function of, yes, mass incarceration and the criminal justice system and the biases inherent in that, but it's also a function of things existing outside those systems in terms of self-perception, public perception, the presumption of guilt, and you only have to look at what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now to see the insistence on a certain set of this population on the innocence of the explicitly and obviously guilty and criminal, and that being the President of the United States. We read the transcript. We read it. It's self-evident. And yet, young black boy steps in an elevator. Just the act of pushing the button to go to the 7th floor presumes guilt. It's so, yes, and all of these biases are built into the system, of course, but the messaging, you know, in the public sphere is incredibly challenging. And you know, in New York, where we're all crammed on top of each other, as this kind of illustrates, that can be intensely dangerous. Intensely dangerous. So,
Tim?
So I answered your questions about New York and its role in criminal justice system, young boys.
And how about you, Tim Blake Nelson? Any key takeaway?
Well, I think that I just proved why he needed to answer first.
Oh.
A key takeaway, I'm just proud to be in this movie. I think, as to quote my friend Brian Stevenson, it's better to be rich and guilty in America than poor and innocent. And what really interests me about this movie, and what I think is very bold in Anthony's direction and Tonya and Nikki's decision to produce this, and the very writing of it, is the fact that Steve Harmon is not purely innocent. And none of us is. And yet, again, to quote Brian Stevenson, should we be judged by, permanently judged, and in this case have the mark of Cain on us for the worst act we've ever committed? And in this case, yes, there's the taint of culpability, but is he a murderer? Absolutely not. And I think that the temerity of this film to examine that and how the color of his skin is really what ultimately construes him in the justice system as a murderer is utterly tragic. And now Jennifer has to speak because she's just amazing in this movie.
Well played. All right. What was
Tell us everything.
What was the original question?
Given the millions of shades of gray that this film illustrates, what is your key takeaway as the overworked public defender?
Well,
Or as a human?
I think the system is so the legal system is so deeply broken and flawed, but it's a sort of microcosm, as Jeffrey said, of the whole country. And you know, our country was built from the beginning on a class system entirely about the color of people's skin and on white supremacy, and it hasn't changed in any way. And we have to dismantle everything really in order to change anything, I think, and certainly to change the justice system. I don't think we can focus on one small part of the entire scaffolding. It all has to sort of be changed. So anyway.
People often ask if it's a true story. And what Walter used to say was, this is a story about many true stories. So I think what you've seen here is a compilation and what you've heard from everybody of a lot of stories and stories that happen every day and stories that happen to people we sit on the bus with and go to school with and are at the doctor's with, and these are all true stories.
One of the themes that you're all touching on is just how fundamentally flawed the systems are across the board. It's not just about the criminal justice system. It's not just about the overworked public defender. It's a very complex, layered film, and that's one of the reasons that I found it to be so fascinating. And throughout the film, and in response to the comment that this is a tough examination of how to handle somebody who's potentially arguably guilty in the eyes of the law, but is not guilty in his mind and is not guilty in his heart. We live in such an extremely punitive society, calling for blood whenever anything happens. How can we turn that around? And I think art like yours is the start of that conversation. How do we work on that?
Tonya?
Well, let me say one thing. I want to be really clear about it because Jeffrey touched on it. We spent enough time in the movie, just a couple seconds as the bodega owner's family came in. Because we spent a lot of time saying, this is wrong, this is unjust, no one did anything, this isn't fair. And then another family walks in and you say, wow, they lost somebody. And I wanted to make sure that we gave due time to the other side of a crime. And that's where it becomes really complicated because the law doesn't look at the social situation. It doesn't look at the nuance, this tiny little moment where he has 10 seconds to decide what he's going to do and whether he intends to be part of the crime or he doesn't know how to not be.
And does he have a choice?
And right, doesn't know how not to be part of the crime, and how does the law deal with that? And in all the work we did in prepping with prosecutors and people that sort of defended and prosecuted, I kept hearing this same thing, this word theater, and this same thing that the truth doesn't matter. It matters how you present it. I wanted to make a film that took it out of the black and white and got into the gray. So we could sit here for an hour and argue both sides of this. You can argue this both ways. I personally would never feel that that boy would ever go to jail for the kind of time they're talking about. But did he tell the bodega owner, hey, I think these guys are coming in here to rob the place? No. Is it his responsibility to? Well, that becomes a bigger conversation. I tried to back everybody into a very dark corner where you have to look at yourself and say, who am I in this moment? How do I deal with it? And what is the prize or punishment for my actions? And taking responsibility for it. And unfortunately, our society is in that place. And it's a bigger conversation about this moment. It's about how we parent, what happens when our kids leave the streets, who's out there watching us all, right? And who are the kids trying to influence and what, all of that stuff. But getting the law to look at the gray is really the challenge on how we charge and analyze crimes versus going for maximums all the time. And in my research and my experience, that is the biggest issue. How we analyze versus saying to the public, we are taking criminals off the street and sweeping kids like Steve Harmon into that category of violent crimes, which is completely unjust.
And I just like to say, I appreciate the question. I really do, because I think it's a conversation we all need to be having about redemption. You know, people sometimes do bad things. There are people who do bad things, who bad things have been done to them, and they know no different. And nothing's been done to help them along. So I think as a society, we do need to be thinking about, are we just going to lock people up and throw away the key and say they're all bad? Or is there room to really find a way for redemption? Prisons are not about redemption. They're not about helping anybody. They're not about making anybody a better person. They're about making them worse, actually. You get locked up in prison, you come out, you're probably a worse criminal than you were most people before you go in, right?
Better.
Right, a better criminal. Yeah, you know what. So the question for us as a society is to think about, how do we really help people become better? How do we service that? And I don't hear us having that conversation hardly at all.
Well, that is one of the conversations that we are trying to push at the Brenner Center. So thank you for those comments. Seeing the shades of gray and also seeing our prisons and our jails as places that need to be rehabilitative instead of punishment-oriented is where our city needs to be going. So I'm not going to get into the closed Rikers discussion here. We don't have time for that. Jeffrey, did you want to add something? I saw you pick up the mic. Just...
I was going to say something, but I think Tonya covered it. I think ultimately that media in some way can play a role. So I think it's really wonderful that you're having this this film festival, because I think ultimately what we're talking about is humanizing folks who too often are not humanized. And often, though, the dehumanization occurs through the media, whether it's, on Fox News, kind of these, repeated stories of black criminality or brown criminality and the hordes of the caravans coming. I heard it. And there's another caravan coming now from the from the south, or whether it's in film, whether it's Clint Eastwood and Make My Day, and it's a .357 Magnum pointed in the face of a cowering black thug. I mean, we are
John Wayne.
What's that?
John Wayne.
Sure. All these images are reinforced in the minds of people, and so the willingness to humanize and individualize a kid like Steve Harmon is often lost. I actually was in a prison for a time before I worked on this film.
Working on a movie.
Sorry? Working on a movie, yeah. Maximum security prison in Indiana. Shot in there for 6 weeks. And I had a really interesting conversation. One of the observations I had was 17 years old, 16, 17 years old. You know very well, and anyone who's a parent knows that that's a time for chaos, amongst your boys. And for some kids who have, limited choices, that those missteps can lead to hard crime, incarceration. The stories that I heard across the board from men who were in this prison were almost identical, and it was in Indiana. So you had pretty much even demographic split between black and white. You had urban poor, you had rural poor, and what I found, almost universally as well, is that there's a correlation between income brackets and class and incarceration that I think we take for granted and we shouldn't. But I had I'm going to tell this story because it kind of was one of the most impactful. I'm not sure how it relates to this. But I was speaking with a guy. We were on a cell block, active cell block. We were filming late at night. The guy, I was talking to him. He was in his cell. He wasn't a part of the film. And I didn't want, wanted to be cool on the cell, on the block. So I said, hey, he was a white guy. I said, we're going to be out of here soon. We're making a lot of noise about 2 o'clock in the morning. He said, no, that's all right. He's sitting there, he said, because I like watching civilians, I don't mind, And I heard that he had some problems with the film. I was like, what was your problem? Well, yeah, it's about the black, I know it's about the black. I said, no, it's a film about incarceration, It's not a film about, any more than Papillon is a film about white people in prison. This is a film about incarceration. Well, I don't know. Turns out he was a separatist. He said he wasn't a race separatist, but he was a government separatist, He had all this. He was a Vietnam vet. I happened to look down. I was like, oh, wow, dude only has one leg. He was in for a heinous crime. We started having a conversation, and he said, the thing you don't really appreciate is the plight of the poor white. And I went, "Bayow," because I'm standing on the outside of the bars looking in on him, and I had to check my privilege. And it was a case for me to kind of shatter my preconceptions and humanize him in a way that, had I not, I wouldn't have begun to have any insight as to what the conditions were. And it was that I mean, it just it just rocked all my all the the lenses that I brought into the space. And I think that if we can do that as a society and begin to humanize one another, then we can begin to reconstruct the biases inside our criminal justice system and in our educational system and in our housing dynamics and things like that will begin to lead us to a more peaceful, less criminal, less violent, less incarcerated society. But so I just say that within the context of this film festival, that to humanize these stories, I think, is a great service in that regard.
So I'm told we have time for just a couple questions. Anybody have a pressing question? All the way in the back. Oh, wait. Somebody's coming with a mic, I think.
Thanks. I thought that was wonderful, really amazing. So in light of all the discussion around ambiguity and understanding people, I'm curious about the artistic decision to make it so clear who we have sympathy for and who are the bad guys.
You have sympathy for?
No, we're rooting for Steve. We really want Steve. And you got, what were your thoughts around how you portrayed King and Bobo? Because we didn't get much of their story, and I'm just like, how did you? Given the comments you've made tonight, it's obviously stuff I think you wrestled with. And I'm just interested to know how you kind of view that.
That's a good question. I wanted to get into the varying degrees of sort of like a loss of innocence. And some people sort of have lost everything their life experience has taken everything that is sort of healthy and good about them, and they've buried it, weighed on, and they're poised to just hurt people, right? There's people that have experienced that sort of trauma, and they've lost touch with that, right? And that's sort of the Bobo of the story. But A$AP Rocky's sort of playing a version of his brother who was murdered on 116th Street and who was a blood. And he's very in touch with the sort of duality of how fortunate he was to get out of that lifestyle and experience his live in that creativity and become who he is. And I think with him, it was really about that finite sort of thing where this kid could go either way. He was at the place where he was living in manipulation and living with a sort of an intention to sort of command what was around him and do bad, but he was really close. He was charming, he was funny, he was human. Right? When you have prosecutors calling people monsters, I grew up in LA during the Richard Ramirez era where like this guy was a monster, he murdered 15 people, he was a monster. You're standing here and they're using that same terminology now to categorically look at huge groups of people so that we can influence how a jury feels about them and how society feels about them. And that's taking away their humanity, right? So the idea with King was that especially like the chess scene where you're like in his story and Rocky is a hard guy not to love. He's just a guy you love. Even in his worst moment in the movie, he's lovable. And that was part of the idea with casting him, was to have that sort of range across the three of them, is sort of how you connect and sympathize with their different stories, because everybody's got a different story, right? We all bring our past to the moment, and we don't all make the same decision based on the moment. It's based on where we are and how we got there.
I think there was another question over here.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say thank you so much for making this film. I currently live on 140th and Broadway, and I used to live on Edgecombe. And so every day I walk outside, I feel like I'm the young man, like Mr. Harmon, and I see these guys on a corner. And when you shot the scene where A$AP was schooling them, you see that red window? You see, why are they always there? And it's like this underworld that we walk past every day. And I also want to say thank you for Mr. Wright's character, because for the first time in a long time, like, we see a father who is an intellectual, who is a creative. And we can tell that the lessons are imprinted in his son, because when you're seeing the film, he actually has when they're laying down, that was what he taught him. And it's a powerful film. And I thank you for everything you did.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And in front, do we have time for one more? I'm sorry, we're being told we do not have any more time.
Can we hear a story?
We actually have 4 more days of this festival for many, many more conversations and many more wonderful films. Please join us for more. I mean, this really connects to everything we're doing here. Couldn't have thought of a better way to open this festival. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for being a part. I want to give a thank you to all the JCC staff, to Joy, to Deva, and please join us upstairs for some dessert and a little more reception, and join us throughout the week. Help us spread the word, grab brochures. Thank you very much and have a good night.